Newsweek, June-14, 1971. Copyright 1971 by Newsweek, Incorporated. Newsweek Talking Magazine is recorded on one record and published weekly in cooperation with the Newsreel Talking Magazine Fund in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, Louisville, Kentucky, read by Milton Metz, Andy Chappell, and Livingston Gilbert. Notice to first recipients of Newsweek. Since you yourselves are sometimes second recipients of this magazine, you have learned the value of promptness. We therefore urge that you will read your Newsweek immediately and put it in the mail. If possible, we suggest that you place your copies directly in the mailbox rather than wait for the parcel postman to pick them up. We remind second recipients to discard their Newsweeks when they have finished with them. Do not return them to the printing house. Changes of address should be sent to us on a postcard. Address: American Printing House for the Blind, P.O. Box 6085, Louisville, Kentucky 40206. Contents for Side 1. Top of the week. Where are they now? The Periscope. National Affairs. Cover story: White House wedding. The war in Indochina. International. Time Out of Joint by George W. Ball. Newsmakers. The media. Science and space. Contents for Side 2 will appear at the beginning of Side 2. Top of the week. White House wedding. There's nothing quite like a White House wedding, a blend of emotion and tradition that is one of the most appealing rituals of the Republic. This week, Patricia Nixon marries Edward Finch Cox, the happy ending to a 7-year romance they kept secret even from their parents. To tell the story of Tricia and her beau, Newsweek's Nancy Ball, who profiled Tricia and her sister Julie Eisenhower in 1969, reported on the wedding plans. Elizabeth Peer focused on the bride, and Noel Ragsdale interviewed friends of the couple in New York. General Editor Richard Beth wrote the cover story. Mr. Nixon and the police. Richard Nixon awakened echoes of his law and order campaign last week, defending the May Day mass arrest by Washington police and convening a White House meeting of police chiefs to discuss the recent series of cop killings. The president was trying not only to boost police morale at the outset of the summer, but to identify himself with a popular political issue. But a special Newsweek 30-city survey showed that the war on the police may in fact be on the decline. Points of interest. How should NATO proceed in approaching the Soviet blocs for talks on mutual troop cuts in Europe? The answer from Lisbon last week: very, very cautiously. Reinhold Niebuhr, the greatest U.S. Protestant theologian of the century, died last week just short of his 79th birthday. Religion editor Kenneth L. Woodward assesses Niebuhr's impact on religious and political thought. It could be the biggest real estate deal ever made by a single owner. The bankrupt Penn Central put up for sale the 29 acres of land and buildings it owns in Midtown Manhattan. The property is valued at $1.2 billion. Shock lung is a secondary complication, sometimes fatal, that often follows major injury. Now, a Duke University scientist has found a drug that can prevent its onset, a steroid hitherto used mainly for poison ivy victims. In college after college around the country, professors are now increasingly engaged in collective bargaining. This new campus union movement may have a profound effect on the nature of higher education. Where are they now? Mother of the groom. There was a time when Frances Woolley Robb could meet the demanding deadlines of her advertising job at a Milwaukee fashion store, keep up with her house cleaning and sewing as well. But Mrs. Robb's well-ordered life began to change in August 1967, when she and her husband, James, an airline executive, received an excited phone call from their eldest son in Washington, D.C. Well, he informed them, we've decided to take the big step. Soon afterward, the White House announced officially that Linda Bird Johnson, the president's elder daughter, would marry Marine Captain Charles S. Robb in December. With that message, the groom's unpretentious parents were thrust into the discomforting glare of national publicity that would follow them for a long time after the White House wedding itself had ended. For the Robbs, the journey to the nation's capital for a hectic round of prenuptial parties was a cheerful homecoming. Both come from old Washington families. Mrs. Robb's father was a close advisor to President Wilson, and they themselves were married there in 1936. The Robbs had been White House guests on several occasions, even before the Johnsons moved in, never considering, of course, the possibility that one day they would return as part of the family. Both were delighted with their week-long stay. We just had a grand time, Mrs. Robb says. It was so peaceful and quiet. Celebrity. Despite the tranquility of their elegant quarters in the executive mansion, the Robbs were a little overwhelmed by the months of hectic activity that preceded the lavish wedding ceremony. Not surprisingly, they often suffered from lack of sleep. "We're early to bed, early to rise people," Frances Robb noted good-naturedly at the time. Nevertheless, the friendly, outgoing couple tried gamely to take celebrity in their stride. "When you find your home has been usurped by the press," Robb chuckled, "you just fall in and try to shape up." Today, the Robbs still reside in the same two-story brick Georgian townhouse on Milwaukee's fashionable east side that they've occupied since 1965. A gracious home furnished with antiques inherited from both their families. Although Frances Robb, now 55, insists that the famous wedding has not altered her life or her husband's, we're back in our happy oblivion, she admits that it did somewhat complicate the lives of their other 3 children. The publicity presented challenges that they might otherwise not have encountered, she recalls a bit unhappily. Problem. Still, Mrs. Robb does not worry about the family of Tricia Nixon's fiancé, Edward Cox. They seem strong enough to take it, she says. In fact, Mrs. Cox can look forward to a good time at the White House. But one problem for both the Nixon and Cox families, Mrs. Robb is certain, was trimming their guest list to a manageable size. "From beginning to end," she says, "I thought of Chuck and Linda's wedding as a private affair." Yet even now, the stylish grandmother candidly admits she still doesn't like to think of herself as a mother-in-law. When people exclaim, "Oh, you're related to the Johnsons," Mrs. Robb's standard reply is, "No, we just share the same grandchildren." Earlier this year, when the Cox-Nixon engagement was announced, Mrs. Robb considered writing Mrs. Cox. But then she confesses, "I didn't know what to say except what Tilly Nugent, Lucy Johnson's mother-in-law, told me. Welcome to the club." The periscope. Blacks on the Black Army. Blacks in and out of Congress are up in arms over the charge that an all-volunteer army would mean an all-poor or all-black military force. Spokesman for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's original group, called the argument downright repugnant. Democratic Representative Ronald Dellums of California, a member of the Black Caucus on Capitol Hill, also damns white liberals who pontificate about their great concern for an all-black army or an all-poor people's army and who support the continuation of the draft. Peking puts steel first. Despite the dismal failure of Mao Zedong's great leap forward in 1948 with its emphasis on backyard steel production, Peking is still putting its industrial development chips on that basic metal. Steel's #1 priority has just been restated with emphasis on plants of all sizes. Latest estimate of Chinese annual steel production is 18 million tons versus 131 million in the U.S., about 127 million in the Soviet Union. Electronics, which Mao's rivals wanted to put first, is also getting new attention, but still rates as a secondary interest. Bonanza for oilmen. The oil industry, which has been angry with the Nixon administration over pollution enforcement and the delays in the Alaska pipeline, is about to be handed a bonanza, a 5-year program permitting a huge accelerated offshore drilling program. What the Russians asked Sadat. Publicly, Soviet President Nikolai Podgorny avoided any comment in Cairo on last month's purges of pro-Moscow officials in Egypt. Privately, communist diplomats report he urged Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to go light on deposed Ali Sabri and his supporters. Harsh treatment, he argued, would stir resentment in Moscow and nervousness among Soviet supporters in other Arab countries. Lockheed's cautious critics. At this week's Senate hearings on federal guarantees for loans to hard-pressed Lockheed aircraft, aerospace industry brass will be conspicuously absent, despite their known opposition to such a deal. The reason? They expect rough handling by Committee Chairman Senator John Sparkman, a pro-Lockheed man. The executives will save themselves for next month's House hearings, chaired by Representative Wright Patman, who does not share Sparkman's enthusiasm for the Lockheed bailout. Ulbricht. Out means out. Walter Ulbricht, the aging, 77, East German communist boss, will give up his last significant political post this month. When he stepped out as East Germany's Communist Party chairman, Ulbricht held on to his job as chairman of the Council of State, a spot that could leave him politically active. The word now is that he will give that up and remain only as honorary party chairman, a strictly ceremonial post. A voice from Spain. Spain's leading daily newspaper, ABC, plans a U.S. edition this fall. The magazine-size international edition will start on the East Coast, with high hopes of expanding later to California's big Spanish-speaking population.
our thrifty allies. Navy officials and Defense Secretary Melvin Laird himself were dismayed to find that Allied warships in the Mediterranean spent an average of 30 days a year at sea. The U.S. Sixth Fleet averages about 200 days annually. The Allies say their long stays in port are to save fuel and other operating costs. Saigon's defense cuts. Saigon now is talking of reducing defense spending, in particular cutting the South Vietnamese army to ease the burden on the country's economy. Skeptics discount the talk for two reasons. One, this is an election year, and two, any reduction in the army, they say, would be matched by an increase in South Vietnam's national police. The understanding Austrians. The Red Chinese had a special reason for sweet reasonableness in setting up diplomatic ties with Austria. No mention, for example, was even made of Taiwan. The reason is that Peking is anxious to establish intelligence operations in Vienna. France. National affairs. White House and Station House. Richard Nixon won the presidency 2.5 years ago, in part by running for sheriff, by pledging himself in his recurring campaign slogan to strengthen the peace forces as against the criminal forces in America. A president, as Mr. Nixon soon discovered, can't really do much about crime, which increased 12% during his first year in office and 11% in his second. But Mr. Nixon does occasionally hang on his badge and remind the nation's lawmen that somebody up there still likes them. Last week he did it again. He delivered a spirited news conference defense of the way the police put down last month's May Day demonstrations in Washington and organized a display of presidential concern over the recent killings of cops in the line of duty. What prompted this last was an authentic urban tragedy: the May 21st murder of 2 New York patrolmen outside a Harlem housing project. The president, who had earlier expressed his and the nation's outrage, followed up last week by calling Attorney General John Mitchell, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and 18 U.S. police chiefs and sheriffs to the White House to discuss what could be done. The answer, as far as the administration was concerned, was not much, given its resistance to making cop killing a federal crime or to enacting stringent gun control legislation. What the host had to offer instead was, one, some strong words about murdering police. Mitchell called the recent slayings inane and senseless, demented, without rhyme or reason. Two, a proposed $50,000 federal death benefit for the families of cops killed in the line of duty. And three, a summons to another bigger conference this week. It came to little more than coffee and sympathy, but it did give police morale a welcome boost at the outset of a tindering new summer. And by no means coincidentally, it reasserted Mr. Nixon's claim to what has long been one of his pet political issues: count. The risk lay in making a bad problem look worse than it really is. The number of officers killed in action has increased on a jagged line recently, from 76 in 1967 to 90 to 100 last year. And the era of off-the-pigs radicalism has produced some few headline assassinations and assassination attempts. Yet figures compiled by the International Association of Chiefs of Police in a federally funded study and a 30-city survey by Newsweek suggest that the up curve is flattening out and may in fact have turned down in much of the U.S. The IACP counted 48 police deaths and 1,031 injuries in the last 6 months of 1970. The body count went up to 52 in the first 5 months of this year, but the injured list was down to 641. The Newsweek survey indicated similarly that the problem has got worse in a few cities. New York, with 7 police deaths this year, and Detroit with 4, have already matched their respective tolls for all of 1970, but has leveled off or improved in most others. Political assassinations, moreover, account for only a fraction of the killings. Cornering a felony suspect or breaking up a family quarrel are far more common hazards for the cops. The pig-baiting rhetoric of the revolutionaries may well have contributed to the bloodletting. When you consistently reinforce in unstable people the idea of killing police officers, said Berkeley's police chief Bruce Baker, someone will do it. But the IACP's log blames only 20 of the deaths and 82 of the injuries over the past 11 months on unprovoked attacks of any sort, revolutionary or otherwise. The figures don't prove anything, argues an official of the Ford-funded Police Foundation, except that there are more police, they're being asked to do more things, and the crime rate is rising. The narcotics problem probably has more to do with attacks on police officers than to the activities of radical groups. None of this is much comfort to the rank-and-file line cop, who hears the bellicose rhetoric, reads the page one atrocity stories, and begins to see black militants and white radicals as enemies in a very real shooting war. Various departments have taken official countermeasures. Chicago fielded more two-man squad cars after several killings in the ghetto last year. San Francisco redid one bombed-out police station with barricades, floodlights, and bricked-up windows. San Diego took to double-checking suspicious calls for help lest one gull the police into an ambush. The slaying of Patrolman Waverly Jones and Joseph Piangentendi in New York set off a morale crisis in the city. One Harlem precinct station was briefly near paralysis over rumors that 200 Black Panthers were advancing on them via the Holland Tunnel and far beyond. The message of Harlem, rumbled Carl Parcell, who heads both the Detroit Police Officers Association and the 150,000-member International Conference of Police Associations, was, speak softly and carry a big gun. Some of the nation's cops are doing just that. Miami area lawmen, who have been attacked twice as often in the past year as they were 3 years ago, have been shooting twice as often too, and have killed 26 persons to 3 police deaths since January 1970. Some Cleveland cops have stocked their squad cars with bootleg Army surplus carbines. In Riverside, California, 2 officers were tricked into ambush and killed last April 2nd, to which police responded by stopping and frisking blacks at random throughout the city and running gun hunting raids on ghetto churches and social clubs. The mood is volatile, the impulse to fight fire with superior firepower. If these radical extremists want war, says Detroit's Parcell, then the police stand ready. Police killers will be eliminated one way or another. Crisis. And police tempers, in turn, become part of the chemistry of war and peace in the ghetto. More than half the riots surveyed by the Kerner Commission started over police incidents. There have been premonitory spring flare-ups in Brooklyn, Baltimore, Chattanooga, Wilmington, North Carolina, and Opelika, Florida. And the summer ahead looks chancy, the more so because of what a National Urban League study last week called the worst employment crisis in almost a decade for Negroes. The League predicted that black unemployment will reach 1 million by midsummer and called for federal disaster area aid to 53 U.S. cities. Mr. Nixon did announce a 7-year high $303 million allocation for summer jobs and recreation for the ghetto young. But the federal money, even at best, can only scratch the surface, and the pinch of inflation and recession has left cash coming from state, local, and private sources critically short. The prognosis for summer was mixed in Newsweek's 30-city survey. A fragile tranquility held in some areas, a fatalistic expectation of low to middle grade disorders in others. The view of some federal intelligence people is considerably bleaker. One of them, Ben Holman, the black director of the Justice Department's Community Relations Service, is said to have told Mitchell recently, "This will be the worst summer yet." Even if it isn't, the tensions between the police and the ghettos and the barrios will endure. And last week's White House meeting made it perfectly clear where Mr. Nixon has put his weight. His invitation list, drawn for him by Hoover, was a curiosity that included the police chief of Dover Township, New Jersey, but not IACP Executive Director Quinn Tam, who's been running an intensive study of attacks on police, or New York's Commissioner Patrick V. Murphy, who heads the nation's largest and currently most attacked police department. The explanation? Both men have long been on Hoover's least wanted list, and both have bumped heads with the administration. Tam as a long-standing advocate of gun control, Murphy as a critic of the Mayday arrests. Flagrant. The meeting went swimmingly. Mr. Nixon came straight to the point. The recent shooting of policemen has assumed national dimensions. Neither he nor anyone else in the room blamed the killings on any national conspiracy. Instead, one participant said, Mr. Nixon ascribed them to a flagrant, arrogant disregard for the law and for those who seek to enforce it. He was nevertheless against making cop killing a federal crime because it would cast the FBI as a national police, and besides, 96.6% of the cases are solved by local police within 30 days. Mr. Nixon did promise a war on the narcotics traffic, and he introduced Mitchell to outline the death benefit plan. He did not discuss gun control at all, and none of the chiefs pressed the point. They talked for nearly 2 hours, then adjourned until this week's expanded meeting of 100 police officials at FBI headquarters. A 2-day seminar at which the Bureau will circulate some of its intelligence on militant groups and counsel on how to prevent attacks on cops. The White House talk made a smash hit just by happening. Dover Township's Richard C. Clement came away enthusing that it was the greatest move in law enforcement I can remember. It was hardly that, but it perked up police spirits in a difficult time, and it was unquestionably popular politics as well. Mayday, Mayday. Despite a singular display of repertorial persistence at last week's news conference, President Nixon stuck tenaciously to his defense of the mass arrests made during Washington's May Day disruptions. Responding to a series of questions from 4 different newsmen, Mr. Nixon praised the Washington police for the right combination of firmness and restraint in a very difficult situation, and said it would be an exaggeration to describe their tactics as unconstitutional. The protesters were hoodlums and lawbreakers, the president said. Then why were so many thousands of May Day cases being dropped or dismissed? Because, said the president somewhat lamely, arrest does not mean that an individual is guilty. But, pressed another reporter, they are not being released on the ground that guilt isn't proved. They are being released on the ground that they weren't properly arrested. Mr. Nixon stuck to his guns. President Nixon's answers were not designed to satisfy liberals, civil libertarians, and members of the legal community who become increasingly critical of the sweeping May Day busts. But the president is persuaded that the strategy remains a popular and practical alternative to violence, regardless of its embarrassing aftermath in the courts. Of an estimated 7,000 arrests made by Washington police on May 3rd, some 4,000 were simply dropped or dismissed because police didn't have enough evidence to convict, or in some cases to justify the arrests. Another 1,000 were allowed to go free in the confusion. Some 1,800 arrestees forfeited $10 collateral each, rather than return for trial. Of the few who were tried, the government won only a handful of convictions, and by the weekend was prepared to proceed in less than 50 cases. Even before the last May Day demonstrators had cleared out of town, the Justice Department was putting heavy pressure on district police and the city prosecutor's office to justify the mass arrests by winning court convictions. Detectives transformed the police academy auditorium into a vast rogues gallery of thousands of still pictures and hundreds of feet of movie film. Some 3,000 officers then spent days poring over the pictures in hopes of coming up with information on specific violations. Assistant Attorney General William Rehnquist argued that a condition of qualified martial law legitimized the arrests, but other Justice Department officials later conceded privately that up to 80% had been unconstitutional. The courts seemed to agree. In fact, Superior Court Chief Judge Harold H. Green hailed Washington Corporation Counsel C. Francis Murphy, the city prosecutor, before his bench for one of the most severe tongue lashings in Washington's judicial history. For the Corporation Counsel to come into this court with hundreds upon hundreds of cases which it knew and must have known completely lacked evidence that would stand up in court is inexcusable, he said. Shortly thereafter, the American Civil Liberties Union won the point in the U.S. Court of Appeals, which ordered a halt in prosecution of cases in which the government lacked sufficient evidence for an arrest. Answers. Having held up the Washington tactics as a model for the nation's police, the administration was not about to let criticism of it go unanswered. Besides the president's remarks last week, Attorney General John Mitchell and Deputy A.G. Richard Kleindienst, increasingly mentioned as Mitchell's likely successor, answered the critics. Kleindienst argued that the arrests made were perfectly legal, even if the chaotic conditions that day prevented police from obtaining sufficient evidence to present in court. The truth, said Kleindienst in a speech, is that the police foiled an attempt to stop the government with a minimum exercise of authority. Any less authority would have risked letting the mob rule the Capitol. Yet for all the talk about vandalism, reports on property damage show that the May Day damage was much less than in previous protests in the city. Even among liberals, there are those who think the May Day detentions might be defensible on the practical ground that they prevented more violent confrontations. But there are doubts on that score even within the government. They wanted their cake, and they wanted to eat it too, said one angry city prosecutor forced to handle many of the cases that never had a chance. And the scenario may well be played out again if anti-war leaders make good their latest threat to return to the Capitol for a fall reprise of May Day. Congress, through the mills. When President Nixon unveiled his revenue-sharing plan last January, Representative Wilbur Mills, the wily Arkansas Democrat who heads the pivotal House Ways and Means Committee, reported that his committee would certainly hold hearings on the president's $5 billion proposal. But, Mills added tartly, the hearings will not be for the purpose of promoting it, but killing it. Last week, Mills finally had a chance to make good on his threat. The result was one of the more dramatic confrontations in the bland world of Nixonian Washington. The administration's choice to sell the plan to an obdurate Mills and his skeptical committee was suave, silver-haired Treasury Secretary John Connally, a fellow Democrat from the Southwest. But it was much more than a match of personalities. For Chairman Mills and the Democrats need to show that they are more than mere obstructionists trying to scuttle President Nixon's plan.
no ally. As the hearings opened, Mills maintained a deceptively low profile. He early waived his chairman's rights to begin the questioning, deferring to Republican Representative John Burns of Wisconsin, the ranking minority member of the committee, and indicated his lack of interest by busying himself with paperwork while Connolly was in the witness chair. Connolly was quickly reminded that Burns, despite his party, was no ally. "You were attempting to sell refrigerators to the Eskimos," Burns said scornfully. He characterized the administration's proposal as the little man in the red suit was going to drop down chimneys with checks for every mayor and governor in the land. Then the Democrats, led by Michigan's Martha Griffiths, took over the attack on the president's proposal. Noting that the Nixon plan would offer money to all communities, both urban and rural, regardless of immediate need, she snapped, "So you're funneling money away from the needy areas to the podunks," replied Connolly. "Podunk is part of America and we don't want to destroy it." But Mrs. Griffiths was unimpressed. She charged that the administration plan was simply an attempt to buy votes nationwide at the expense of cities and states that have striven to finance their expenses with local taxes, often unsuccessfully. Faint praise. Yet it was Mills who ground Connolly the most exceeding fine. He damned the Secretary's opening statement with faint praise indeed. "Let me congratulate you on a very fine statement in behalf of a very weak cause." Next day he lectured Connolly, "You brought into the committee room a Trojan horse." He called the Nixon scheme the most dangerous proposal that's ever been developed and said it smacked of taxation without representation. Moreover, he said, while the president's plan calls for no-strings grants to states and cities, that rule could be changed by Congress at any time. The consequences, Mills said, would be greater federal authority over the right of states to tax and spend as they saw fit. "There isn't a ghost of a chance that Congress will pass revenue sharing," he summed up. "Anyone who thinks I'm going to change my mind doesn't know what he's talking about." Mills' rebuff was not the only indignity suffered by the administration on Capitol Hill last week. Aside from the general revenue-sharing plan being considered by the Mills Committee, the President has proposed special revenue sharing, under which as much as $11 billion would be channeled into various categories of urban programs. In its first test in the House last week, the special revenue-sharing concept suffered a setback after defeating an administration proposal that would provide $2 billion for job training. The Democrats substituted a 5-year public service employment bill, giving states and cities $5 billion for hiring the unemployed. Muskie plan. Thus, as the week wore on, Wilbur Mills and the Democrats were clearly on the offensive on the revenue-sharing issue and making the most of it. Democratic presidential hopeful Edmund Muskie of Maine opened hearings in the Senate on his own hastily drafted alternative, providing a revenue-sharing fund of $6 billion, as opposed to the administration's figure of $5 billion, for the state. And in contrast to the administration plan's sour reception before Ways and Means, the Muskie plan was warmly endorsed by 10 big city mayors. New York's John Lindsay, for one, said his city would receive only $189 million the first year under the Nixon bill. But if the Muskie proposal were adopted, Lindsay said, New York could expect more than $459 million. Still, the key man was Mills. In the likely event the president's program dies, the question remained just what Mills planned for the cities. Some Capitol Hill sources believe that Mills will eventually propose an urban bank from which cities can borrow money to handle their problems. Moreover, they expect that he will urge another House committee to supply additional funds for such specific purposes as law enforcement and housing. But characteristically, Wilbur Mills was simply not saying what his plans were. "I have something in mind for the cities," he told one committee colleague last week. "I recognize their needs, and eventually I'll address myself to that area." War crimes. And now a general. The Army's investigation of alleged Vietnam War crimes reached higher last week than ever before. 2 officers of the ill-fated Americal Division were charged with murdering a total of 8 civilians in a series of separate incidents in Quang Ngai Province, some of them by potshots from helicopters. Lieutenant Colonel William McCloskey, 39, was accused of killing 2 non-combatants in March 1969. But it was his commanding officer, Brigadier General John W. Donaldson, 47, accused of killing 6 and assaulting 2 others between November 1968 and the end of January 1969, who drew the full glare of public attention. Donaldson, the brigade commander at the time, is the highest-ranking U.S. officer and the first West Point graduate to face war crimes charges in the Indochina War, and the first U.S. general so accused since the Philippine insurrection 70 years ago. The case has had some overtones of the murders at My Lai.
The operation in which the incidents allegedly occurred swept through the same province in which My Lai is located. Donaldson's brigade was the 11th Infantry, the same unit that sent First Lieutenant William Kelly's platoon into My Lai some 8 months before. Indeed, the man Donaldson succeeded was Colonel Orrin K. Henderson, who himself now awaits court-martial on charges of attempting to cover up the My Lai massacre. Donaldson brought a formidable record as a scholar, an athlete, and a soldier to his Vietnam command. The lean, battle-hardened career officer holds a master's degree in foreign affairs, taught French and German at West Point after study at the University of Paris, and was a member of the 1948 U.S. Olympic pentathlon team. His career spans America's last 3 wars and has earned him 2 Silver Stars and Distinguished Flying Crosses, 3 Bronze Stars and Legions of Merit, and a Purple Heart, plus a blaze of lesser medals, including 2 from the South Vietnamese government. Married and the father of 2 sons, Donaldson was a top planning officer for the Joint Chiefs of Staff until reassigned to 1st Army Headquarters after the investigation began last November. Death penalty. The Army is withholding details of the charges until it completes its investigation, but the accusations reportedly sprang from a helicopter pilot's report last year that the 2 officers in separate incidents fired at civilians from the air with M16 rifles, killing several. The charges could bring death upon conviction, but Donaldson's attorneys are expected to argue that he was only responding to Viet Cong sniper fire, a defense that military law experts believe could be far more difficult to refute than the superior orders argument put forth by Lieutenant Kelly. Before they actually come to trial, the cases must be reviewed by 1st Army Command, then by an Article 32 investigation, the Army equivalent of a grand jury. And Donaldson, for his part, seems to be weathering the storm with combat cool. When the full facts are known, he said last week, I'm fully confident I will be completely vindicated. Enlistment blues. It was a far cry from the World War I poster of a stern Uncle Sam captioned, I Want You. There on primetime TV screens was a sexy stewardess welcoming young men aboard an airliner with breathy murmurs about the pleasures of 16 months in Europe. Another spot featured pro football quarterbacks, one black, one white, heaving passes as an announcer intoned, you have to make plenty of tough decisions yourself. In a third, the voice of a U.S. Army recruiter backed by a throbbing rock guitar told potential enlistees, today's Army wants to join you. The lively commercials and similar ads in magazines were all part of a 13-week, $18 million nationwide experiment aimed at buffing up the Army's tarnished image and helping to realize President Nixon's dream of an all-volunteer Army by mid-1973. The main thrust of the campaign was to stress the travel, adventure, and educational opportunities available to enlistees, as well as the Army's flexible new creative management. Results of the campaign are still being assessed, and the Army expects the real payoff to come later this year when summer vacations are over. But preliminary figures indicate that the $18 million advertising drive may have been responsible for 2,500 new recruits, which tallies up to a cost of only $7,200 per man. Politics. A quiet revolution? At Woodrow Wilson High School in San Francisco last week, senior students were called into a morning assembly to hear about the importance of registration and voting in a democracy. It was the same sort of civics lesson American schools have conducted for generations, but it had a new finale. After the lecture, the students filed over to tables where county voting registrars were waiting to sign them up on the spot. Imaginative campaigns, like the one at Woodrow Wilson, are now being run in scores of cities from coast to coast to register the 11.4 million Americans between 18 and 21, whose right to vote in federal elections was granted by Congress last year and upheld last December by the U.S. Supreme Court. Major labor unions, civic and civil rights groups, and the Democratic Party are developing a strategy that includes appeals over rock radio stations and registration booths set up at drag strips and surfing beaches. At stake for 1972 are some 25 million potential first-time presidential voters. Not just the newly enfranchised 18 through 20-year-olds, but 13.6 million others who will have turned 21 since the '68 election. The importance of a group this size in another close presidential election can hardly be ignored. And, depending upon ratification of the proposed 26th Amendment and passage of various state voting laws, the young voters could have a sizable impact in state and local elections. Traditionally, younger Americans have registered and voted in proportionately smaller numbers than any other age group, and young voters generally have tended to follow the party choice of their parents. Results of the current registration campaign are still fragmentary, but leaders of the drive do detect evidence that the old patterns may not hold. At Arizona State University in Tempe, for example, the League of Women Voters helped to register fully 4,500 of some 6,000 eligible students. In Pennsylvania, a joint effort involving both parties, several unions, and the Pennsylvania State Education Association put 183,000 new young voters on the rolls. And the Alliance for Labor Action, sponsored largely by the United Auto Workers and the Teamsters, reports that its IMPACT program is registering nearly 90% of all the eligible high school students it has gone after in California, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. 100 to 1. As provocative as the size of the turnout is the lopsided way in which it has fallen to the Democrats or remained independent. Around the country, young people are registering Democratic by margins running from 2 to 1 to 6 to 1. At one mainly black high school in the Los Angeles area, the turnout went 100 to 1 for the Democrats. And even in California's conservative Orange County, according to one report, half of the first 925 youthful registrants were Democrats. 30% registered Republican, 20% independent. Although they suggest a Democratic trend, the early figures are not in themselves good indicators of how solidly partisan young people will be. While some new registrants may be expressing a basic sympathy for Democratic policies, others are merely qualifying themselves for the important primary contest in 1972. People simply realize that most of the action seems to be in the Democratic Party, says Charlotte Rowe Kimball, 27, executive director of Frontlash, a New York-based registration project funded in part by the AFL-CIO. Perhaps more important, the current figures are coming largely from campuses and classrooms, although fully 60% of the newly enfranchised young Americans are out of school and at work. Shift? Even the experts are divided over the extent to which a quiet revolution may be underway. It would seem that the young voters will be no more Democratic than their fathers were in 1940, when the 21 to 25 age group voted moderately more Democratic than the nation as a whole, says Newsweek special consultant Richard Scammon, co-author of The Real Majority. This time, the young people will vote 5 or 6 points more liberal than their parents. California pollster Mervyn D. Field sees a more significant shift. Says Field, I see the 18-year-old vote, combined with other people who will vote in 72 for the first time, as a tremendous force, a powerful explosive. A vigorous youth vote would clearly have its greatest impact at the local level, particularly in areas with heavy college and university populations. Ratification of the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 in all elections, is moving steadily ahead, despite conservative opposition. 32 states already have approved the amendment, and proponents predict that they will have the required 38 by a fall. Some states, such as Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Alabama, are also pushing their own measures to give 18-year-olds the vote. In many cases, the most controversial question is no longer whether young people should vote, but where. Around the nation, a patchwork of regulations now applies to students of voting age. Married students on campus at Princeton may vote there, singles may not. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, a Harvard student on full scholarship may vote locally, but one who still receives support from home can vote only there. The example of Berkeley, California, where a large university population helped elect 3 radicals to the city council, is frequently cited by state legislators who fear the growth of student power. Despite all the doubts and fears, however, little concrete about the new youth vote is likely to be known before the campaign of 72 moves into high gear. While the young people are reported to be more issue-oriented than ever before, ecology, consumerism, the economy, the war, leaders of the registration drive also say that they are waiting for a candidate. The real factor is going to be who's running. Tom Stemberg, 22, of the Harvard-based National Movement for the Youth Vote, told Newsweek's Richard Stout, if it's Humphrey against Nixon and no fourth party, I wouldn't anticipate an under 21 turnout over 20%. If there's an exciting candidate and the war is not wound down, it could be very big. Crime. Corona in court. The man accused of the biggest multiple murder in U.S. history had his day in court last week, and the presiding judge was at pains to see it was a fair one. Burly, Mexican-born Juan V. Corona, 37, the suspect in the murder of more than a score of migrant farm workers found buried along California's Feather River, walked into Sutter County Courthouse, 47 miles north of Sacramento. And District Judge J.J. Hankins promptly ordered the hearing closed to the public. While scores of newsmen clamored outside, the former mental patient pleaded not guilty to 10 counts of murder. The judge couldn't keep the lid entirely on. The paper surfaced a happier days photo of Corona in a wide sombrero and a vaquero suit taken a few months before his arrest. Scraps of the state's case leaked out. Deputies had found a machete under the floor mat in Corona's van, and some receipts bearing his signature in one of the graves. The man who said he saw one of the victims get in a car with Corona was arrested as a material witness. And even then, authorities did not consider the case closed. While Corona was being arraigned, a light plane equipped with infrared cameras was aloft, searching for more undiscovered graves. Late in the week, as the Feather River's waters receded, the 24th and 25th bodies were unearthed. Minneapolis, a life under Stenvig. If Philadelphia elects Frank L. Rizzo as its mayor next fall, it won't be the first big U.S. city to turn to a tough cop for municipal leadership. Minneapolis elected a burglary squad detective, Charles S. Stenvig, as its mayor 2 years ago, and was expected to re-elect him this week in a one-sided race against a black school official. To learn what happens under a policeman mayor, Newsweek contributing editor Charles Roberts, who once lived there, revisited Minneapolis. His report. To an occasional visitor, Minneapolis hasn't changed much since its voters moved Chuck Stenvig, 43, a silver-haired honest cop, upstairs from a police lieutenant's desk to the mayor's office of its Romanesque turn-of-the-century city hall. Outwardly, it is still a clean, civilized, and prosperous town. Mayor Stenvig has not made it the police state that some of his foes predicted after he won a landslide victory with his "Take the Handcuffs Off the Police" campaign. Beneath this surface appearance, however, it is now clear that Minneapolis got much more than a change of faces at City Hall when it elected a policeman. That 1969 election and 2 years of Stenvig have changed the whole political climate, power structure, and style of government in a city once noted for liberal activist mayors such as Hubert Humphrey, 1945 to 49, and Stenvig's four-term predecessor, Arthur Naftalin, who returned to teaching at the University of Minnesota. The new climate is distinctly conservative. The old power structure, a loose, bipartisan coalition of businessmen, labor leaders, and intellectuals, has crumbled. The mayoral style has changed to a wait-and-see method that Stenvig calls responsiveness to the majority, and his critics call stagnation. A disaster. There's little doubt that a majority of voters like both Stenvig and the changes. It is equally clear that the city's one-time kingmakers, or most of them, regard Stenvig as a disaster. But Stenvig's success still poses some questions. How did a lackluster ex-plainclothesman get so popular? And what happens when a city's establishment, its civic leaders, loses influence? Stenvig's supporters see no mystery in his popularity. A grandson of Norwegian immigrants, he has simply captured the mood of the town with a huge German and Scandinavian population, they say, by strengthening its police force, defending the cops against their critics, expressing his disapproval of school busing, "I want my kids to eat lunch at home," and using his limited power to hold the line on taxes. He has wooed organized labor and the elderly, an ever-growing percentage of the electorate as the young and affluent move to the suburbs. And perhaps most important, there have been no major racial disturbances since his election. There's a lot of pluses that the mayor has done since he's been in office, says Stenvig's executive secretary, Thomas Ogdahl, an ex-insurance salesman whose perception of winning issues is better than his grammar. What we need is creative leadership, and what we've got is a vacuum, answers Thomas F. Beach, a young establishment spokesman who is willing to be quoted. Other community leaders or erstwhile leaders who insist on anonymity under the "Don't Fight City Hall" rule express fears that the police, with no civilian control, are getting out of hand, that the mayor's stand on busing has jeopardized the city's desegregation plan, and that he's oblivious to such issues as ecology, and that while maintaining a strong law and order stance, he's doing little to arrest the city's decline. Under Stenvig, the city's crime rate has started moving downward, and the most volatile issue in town these days is the police force's handling, or manhandling, of Negroes. The city's non-white population has increased by 38%, from 11,785 to 18,998 in the past decade, and spilled out of two ghettos into some previously all-white neighborhoods. The Negroes still make up less than 4.5% of the total population, a tiny figure compared, say, with Washington's 71%. But critics charge, police now swing their nightsticks more freely, and they take special aim at blacks. As proof, civil rights advocates point to a rash of lawsuits against the city charging police beatings. They also accuse Stenvig of emasculating the Commission on Human Relations by signing an ordinance eliminating its power to subpoena policemen accused of brutality against minority groups. "I feel now I would be safer in Johannesburg, South Africa, than I am in Minneapolis," said a black minister after the law was changed. Impartial. That's baloney, says Deputy Police Chief Eugene Wilson, noting that a Hennepin County grand jury voted no indictments last March after investigating 30 cases of alleged police brutality. That grand jury, carefully choosing its words, found no evidence of a deliberate, calculated policy of unfair, repressive law enforcement, emphasizing the word policy in its report. If I didn't believe the mayor sincerely wanted fair and impartial law enforcement for everybody, I wouldn't be a part of his administration, Wilson adds with evident sincerity. A recent case that has aroused civil rights advocates even more than alleged police beatings involves a 12-year-old Negro boy and a police dog named Mason. Last April 10th, Randy Samples, who had gone downtown to buy a poster, was drawn into a crowd watching the arrest of two Negroes outside a Hennepin Avenue amusement arcade. Accounts differ as to how the boy and the dog tangled. The police say Randy hit the dog with his rolled poster, and Randy says the dog attacked him first. Well, all witnesses agree that the Samples boy was dragged half a block down the street, feet first, by two policemen, a show of force that many thought excessive. He was taken to the police station, where he again encountered the dog, the police say by accident, and then was released without charges. Lonnie T. Morgan, a former University of Minnesota halfback, and now the Stenvig-appointed chairman of the Human Relations Commission, happened to witness the incident. I was shaking, he recalled later. I got kind of sick. An isolated incident, said Stenvig's defenders. But critics contended that the Samples incident illustrated the new climate created by the mayor. Rational men will probably argue for another 2 years over how far Stenvig has moved Minneapolis and in what direction. Actually, it is arguable, from all the evidence, whether the mayor sees it as his job to move the city or as on taxes simply to hold the line. But one impression of Minneapolis under Stenvig seems unarguable after its first 2 years, and it is that a policeman mayor can give a city confronted with change a feeling of security, even while temporizing on important issues. The cab driver said it all as he drove me out Interstate 35W to the airport. Stenvig hasn't done much. He hasn't done much right, and he hasn't done much wrong. But it's nice to know that if anything happens, we've got a tough guy who can handle it in City Hall. Cover story, White House wedding. When 16-year-old Maria Monroe married Samuel Gouverneur in the East Room of the White House in 1820, 42 persons attended the wedding, and a Washington newspaper gave the event 34 words 2 days later. When 22-year-old Alice Roosevelt married Representative Nicholas Longworth in the same room 86 years later, there were 1,000 guests looking on. The French government sent the couple a Gobelin tapestry worth $25,000, and the bride wore 2 diamond necklaces, both gifts from the groom. Neither of these extremes, the provincial snobbery or the imperial opulence, has been seen since in the White House, and they have not been needed. A White House wedding on whatever scale is the most appealing and perhaps the rarest of all the public ceremonies in America. And when 25-year-old Patricia Nixon marries Edward Finch Cox on Saturday in the White House Rose Garden, or if it rains, in the East Room, not even the blights and hostilities of the age will be able to dilute the occasion's traditional and quite special commingling of private joy, public goodwill, and national esprit. In a sense, the most unusual aspect of Saturday's wedding is the presence of Tricia Nixon in it. Reticent by nature and resistant to public exposure as a result of long years of living in the political bubble, the president's elder daughter would seem to be the last to turn her marriage ceremony over to public inspection. She and Eddie Cox, 24, a handsome socialite law student, kept their engagement secret even from their parents for nearly 2 years before disclosing it last Thanksgiving. At all times in the 7.5 years they have known each other, she has fought with fierce ingenuity to keep both the fact and the details of their romance secret. And yet, when the time came to be married, Tricia's sense of tradition and family loyalty, preeminently Nixonian qualities that she shares with her parents and younger sister Julie Eisenhower, persuaded her to commit her wedding to the most public residence in America. A wedding is basically the couple's day, she said last week in a break from the weeks of nonstop preparation. But it is a day that you want to share with a lot of people and make as many people happy as possible, including yourself. Basically, we're having just about everything that we want in our wedding. Assistant First Lady. The bride's acquiescence to a White House wedding does not imply that she will be at all unhappy to leave the huge old mansion. In reply to question, she says pointedly that she will miss only my parents. From all accounts, she never really figured out what to do with herself in her 2 years' residency on Pennsylvania Avenue. She did not enjoy the protocol and empty chit-chat that went with being an Assistant First Lady, but she derived no consistent satisfaction, either from a stint as a tutor to 3 underprivileged children in a Washington grade school. Aloof, impeccably diplomatic and square, petite, 5 feet 3 inches, 95 pounds, and doll-like in appearance, Tricia acquired a reputation as a postcard princess
that did not mesh at all well with her naturally quick tongue and her solid knowledge of fashion, antiques, and art. Tricia did brilliantly in the tasks she undertook: as guide to a televised tour of the White House, as hostess of a grand White House ball for visiting Prince Charles and Princess Anne of England, as a campaigner for her father in Virginia. But she earned no credit with the ladies of the White House press, who went on calling her Little Bo Peep. Tricia felt that the press corps wished to invade her privacy, a truth that became all the more nettlesome as her romance with Ed Cox progressed. He was as enigmatic a figure as she, a rich, socially active New Yorker who nevertheless spent his summers working as a reporter for the liberal New Republic and as one of Ralph Nader's original readers, putting the Cox name to a blistering denunciation of the Federal Trade Commission. His politics remain a good deal more liberal than hers, but they compromise by calling themselves independents. A sailor, fisherman, tennis player, when he plays squash, I get out my pom-poms, said his wholly non-athletic fiancée. Eddie has made his way gracefully through Princeton, 68. Put in a year at Yale's architecture school to avoid the draft while he decided what he really wanted to do. Then 2 years ago plunged into the rigors of Harvard Law. His friends are all socialites, Ivy Leaguers, sportsman professionals like himself, and they are not overwhelmed that he is marrying a president's daughter. As usher Gregory Hedberg remarked, the main difference between Eddie's and Tricia's wedding and the weddings of the other classmates he has attended is that this one is taking place at home. Even before the fact, it was apparent that the White House nuptials would carry the Nixonian trademark of meticulous planning. Tricia and Eddie acceded to Mrs. Nixon's request that the guest list be limited to 400 so that all could be seated, rain or shine, and each family invited 200. The list has been kept secret, but it inevitably includes cabinet officers, Washington eminences, Chief Justice and Mrs. Warren Burger, Nicaraguan Ambassador Guillermo Sevilla Sacasa, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, old friends of Mr. Nixon's, Bebe Robozo, the Robert Applin-Apps, presidential legacies, Linda Bird Robb and Lucy Nugent, both married during their White House residency, and 87-year-old Alice Roosevelt along with herself, as well as friends of the Coxes and of the bridal couple. There are some mild surprises in those who got invitations. Ralph Nader and Harrison McCall, who was Mr. Nixon's first campaign manager in 1946 and the man who gave Tricia her first savings bond, and those who didn't. Mrs. Anna Chenault, friend of the Chungs and social tigress of the Watergate. With her unflagging public chin-upmanship, Trish declared herself delighted to have turned over part of her precious guest list to the demands of protocol. Most of the people who are invited are very close, and almost all the cabinet are close friends, she said. We're not having many officials, and the officials we are having, we know. The ordeal. Weeks ago, Tricia was seen carrying an armful of wedding books around the White House, including one called White House Brides. She undoubtedly needed them all. She had had to deal with all the exhilarating but time-consuming chores of any bride coming into a big wedding. The selection of china, blue tree, designed by Lennox, silver, Luntz Eloquence, crystal, trousseau, I haven't gotten any hot pans yet, wedding gown, bridesmaids' gowns and bouquets, decorations, flowers, music, food and drink, the wedding cake and the religious service, and all the special demands of presidential celebrity besides. More than 500 news personnel of various kinds will be there, not including Judith Martin of the Washington Post, who was banned for having crashed Julie Eisenhower's wedding reception in New York and written an unroseate account of it. The television networks requested live coverage. Tricia and her parents decided on a filmed record instead. The bride herself had described the preparations as an ordeal when she first talked about them in March. But by last week, she was serene and unflappable, buoyed by the progress already made, by the lush Washington spring outside the White House windows, and by the eternal chemistry of the occasion. I am pretty calm, she told Newsweek's Nancy Ball. I haven't lost any weight, and maybe I've gained a couple of ounces, hopefully. After a presidential campaign, nothing seems too disruptive. I always compare everything to that in terms of output of energy. By the same yardstick, her father ought to be the most relaxed man in Washington, and according to Tricia, he is. I don't think he's nervous about the wedding, she said. He's been through one before. He can more relax this time. He knows what's expected. Overcrowded days. All the same, no big wedding takes place without gigantic efforts in some quarters. And not unexpectedly, a heroine and a hero have emerged in addition to the hard-working White House staff. The heroine, inevitably, is Tricia's mother, the incomparable logistician and morale booster of the Nixon family, who began weeks ago like a football coach by studying films of Lucy Nugent's White House reception and went on from there to an endless link of overcrowded days. The hero is Ed Cox, who has managed to participate in most of the arrangements by phone from Cambridge at the same time that he is plowing through his second-year law school finals, which did not end until
10 days before the wedding. Life is like that, said Ed's mother, Mrs. Howard Cox. They want to see if you can take it. The sense of an ordeal by fire, common to all weddings, has been augmented in Tricia's case by the threat of a counter-demonstration outside the gates. A Washington and Lee University senior named Jeff Gingold, one-time chairman of the Student Coalition for Nixon Agnew in New Jersey, said that he had obtained a demonstration permit for the ellipse on the afternoon of June 12th. He said his followers will sing, dance, jump up and down, and run around the White House to protest semi-official extravaganzas like Tricia's wedding while the Vietnam War goes on. Tricia knows of the demonstration, but does not chip her perfect reserve. It's a free country, she said blandly. I hope we don't infringe on each other's rights. I know we're not planning to interfere with their demonstration. Do you think there should be a right to have a wedding? Assuming no intervening act of God, the final affirmation will take place this Saturday at 4 p.m. in the Rose Garden, Tricia's own choice of a site instead of the indoor setting White House weddings past. Guests will arrive through the East Garden, where a 6-piece U.S. Air Force string ensemble will be playing, to be escorted to their seats by one of Ed's 8 groomsmen. A 22-piece Army String Orchestra will play a program selected by Tricia, ranging from Handel's Water Music to Fritz Loh's Come to Me, Bend to Me. Meanwhile, the wedding party will be forming in the Blue Room. Maid of honor Mary Ann Maisie Cox, Ed's sister, and the 2 junior bridesmaids, Amy and Beth Nixon, cousins of the bride, will wear high-waisted silk organdy dresses of lilac underskirted with mint green, flouncy layered organdy hats embroidered with flowers, and French silk print shoes with ankle straps. Julie Eisenhower, the matron of honor, will wear the same dress with colors reversed. The bride's own gown is supposed to remain a cosmic top secret until the day of the wedding, but it will not be radically dissimilar. All the dresses are the work of Priscilla of Boston, a conservative designer who has styled more than 200 dresses for Mrs. Nixon over the years. You've got to worry about everything, Priscilla said recently. The girls can't have different colors of lipstick or wildly different coiffures. They've all got to wear similar lingerie and have the same accessories. The ceremony. At precisely 4 p.m., at Julie's wedding in New York 2.5 years ago, the ceremony began 1 minute ahead of time and everything stayed on schedule throughout. Tricia will descend the outside stairs of the White House on the arm of her father and enter the Rose Garden, walking east to west up the center aisle to a simple flower-banked wooden altar just outside Mr. Nixon's office. The ceremony will be performed by the Reverend Edward Latch, former pastor of the National Methodist Church in the Wesley Heights district of Washington, and ministered to the Nixons during Tricia's childhood and her father's vice presidency. Latch was the victim of one of the few snafus of the wedding preparations. Somehow word leaked out that he had been chosen to officiate, and he learned of it from the newspapers 2 days before Tricia asked him directly. The wedding service will last about 10 minutes and will be an ecumenical mixture of the Episcopal, Methodist, and Roman Catholic services. Ed is Episcopalian, but Tricia, on non-wedding days, still considers herself a birthright Quaker. This was Tricia's idea, Latch said. It's a creation on her part, achieved from other sources that appeal to her. She put a great deal of thought into it. The service consists mainly of prayers and the exchange of vows, and at Latch's urging, the couple will kneel in prayer after they have been pronounced man and wife. At the end of the ceremony, the newlyweds and their party will return to the Blue Room for official photos and the rigors of the reception line, which could take more than an hour. At last, Tricia will move into the East Room for a dance with her father, his first ever in the White House. She'll dance first with Ed. I'm excited that my father will be dancing again, says Julie. I haven't seen him dance since my wedding. Tricia will waltz with her father. The rest of the program by Bill Harrington's 15-piece band will be traditional, too. The bride and groom may be only 25 and 24 years old, but their toes still tap to old-fashioned show tunes, If I Loved You, Wunderbar, Burt Bacharach, and more waltzes. It's the most fun to dance a waltz with Eddie, Tricia said at her last news conference in March. So rare today to find someone who can waltz. In due course, the wedding couple will move into the entrance hall to confront the wedding cake, a 6-tiered, 6-foot, 10-inch tower weighing 350 pounds and rising over a snowy base cake, 5 feet in diameter. The whole construction will take a week to bake, assemble, and decorate, but the White House provided a scaled-down version of the recipe, one that Mrs. Nixon has had for years, for those who wanted to try it at home. New York Times food editor Raymond A. Sokoloff had just that done, and reported that the recipe produced mush on the outside of the layer and soup on the inside. The trouble being that the recipe called for too many egg whites rather than whole eggs, causing the cake batter to overflow the pan. The White House revised the recipe. The Times tried and failed again. The stories were witty, but Tricia was not amused. I've had a piece of the cake, Tricia reported icily last week. I know that it works.
I think that what they might need is some cooking instructions. After the cake cutting, Tricia will ascend the grand staircase to toss her bridal bouquet, presumably to Maisie Cox, 25, a reigning deb in her day, and now a brand new unmarried graduate of the Yale School of Art and Architecture. At this point, however, Tricia will break with tradition. The two Johnson girls and most of their predecessors simply disappeared upstairs after the bouquet toss and were never seen again, making their way out of the White House and the city of Washington by the most devious means possible. When Woodrow Wilson's daughter, Eleanor, married Treasury Secretary William McAdoo in 1914, she planted a decoy car at each of the 4 gates of the White House. All 4 cars sped off simultaneously, while the McAdoos made their escape in a 5th. The Johnson girls apparently uncovered at least one secret exit from the White House and offered to share their knowledge with Tricia, but she has forborne all ruses. We're going out the back door, she says, meaning straight out into Pennsylvania Avenue, and she will still be wearing her wedding dress, giving everyone a chance to throw rice and cheer their departure. After that, a suitable mystery descends. I'm not planning to spend my honeymoon in New York City. I think you can rule that out, the future bride said. But she laughingly insists that they might turn up anywhere else in the eastern or western hemispheres. One rumor, based on the alleged inquiries of a couple of Secret Service types, has them going to Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands. But the truth is that few people really know, and none of these will say. Honeymoon? What honeymoon? Purred Mrs. Cox. Mothers are the last to know about such things, you know. And what does it matter where they go? Being with Ed is what Tricia describes, naturally enough, as the most pleasing prospect of their marriage. Ed's very adventuresome, so I'm looking forward to going on some adventures with Ed, she said. I think we'll lead each other astray in the best sense of the word. It is an appealing vision of marriage, this business of leading each other benevolently astray, and it follows logically enough on a 7-year courtship in which they tried with great success to lead everyone else astray. Their first public appearance came when he served, at her request, as one of her 2 escorts to the International Debutante Ball in New York City in 1964, at which she made her debut into the fashionably circumscribed world of New York society. Despite the tightness of their microcosm, Ed and Tricia really had little in common. She was a politician's child, a well-traveled, much-photographed celebrity, who knew no real privacy until after her father's 1962 defeat for governor of California. Then the family moved to New York, and Mrs. Nixon, swearing that neither she nor her daughters would ever campaign again, set about establishing her children in the comfortable and secluded schools and drawing rooms of the Eastern rich. Social scene. Ed Cox was already there and had been for generations. His father, Howard Ellis Cox, is a wealthy lawyer. His mother, a driving grande dame whose forebears were Livingstons, Schuylers, Van Rensselaers, and most of the other right 18th century names. Ed automatically went to the proper schools. Trinity in New York, then Princeton, finally Harvard Law, but that was only the half of it. He played first-rate tennis at the Meadow Club in Southampton, entertained friends at his family's elegant little estate in West Hampton Beach, and dutifully wound himself up for the lengthy winter rounds of balls, tea dances, and parties that make up the New York social tournament. It may not have been the most important game in the world, but Ed and his sister Maisie were what one friend calls social superstars. His older brother Howard, now a 27-year-old Boston financier, was a much less conspicuous figure on the scene. Tall, good-looking, with an apparently irresistible blend of humor and earnestness, Ed was one of the most sought-after young men of his day, and he found time to date every deb in New York, although his nickname of Fast Eddie really was hung on him at all-male Trinity School, where as editor of the school paper, he was forever calling for quick copy. One girl who pined for Eddie recalls that she finally nailed him as an escort to a major ball. When they returned in the wee hours to her parents' hushed apartment, he talked over scrambled eggs of American history. The politician's daughter was really a little out of her league in this company, and those who know the Coxes believe that it is probably true that the Nixons waited in vain for a dinner invitation from the Coxes after their children began dating seriously in the late 60s, before Mr. Nixon's election to the presidency. On the other hand, there is no sign that anyone ever tried to dissuade Eddie and Tricia themselves. There seems to have been an unfrivolous attachment right from the beginning. Tricia recalls that they played a word game, hangman, at the intermission of their first dance, and she's still impressed by the incredibly esoteric word, infracaninophile, or lover of underdogs, that her 17-year-old escort came up with. She has played the same theme with variations every time she has referred to him, invariably speaking of his intelligence, his wide range of interests, his articulateness. I love to share intellectual things with him, Tricia said last week, although her own tastes, aside from a fondness for good poetry, rarely reach further than popular histories and biographies and diverting periodicals. Purposeful stance.
Shortly after Tricia moved into the White House in early 1969, she and Eddie secretly pledged to marry. And from then on, their lives became a series of married duplicities interrupted by frequent separations while he pursued his studies and she dated decoys and measured out the days in her pink second-floor bedroom at the White House. It was no sedentary courtship, however. They met in Washington, New York, Cambridge, West Hampton, Camp David, Key Biscayne, San Clemente, and who knows how many other places. Restaurant and theater owners smuggled them in and out of their establishments, and friends offered them refuge. They also found a welcome casualness about their presence in Cambridge, where magazines with their pictures on the cover could stay face up on coffee tables without anyone seeming to notice. Still, Tricia was hardly the girl next door. She did not like it at all when she went to Ed's Washington apartment once during his nadir stint and found his roommate in his underwear scratching himself. Last Thanksgiving, Ed pulled himself into a purposeful stance. He was white as a sheet, Tricia recalls, and asked to see the president for a chat. He emerged sometime later with a presidential blessing. Tricia began wearing a diamond sapphire ring that had belonged to Ed's grandmother. In March, they announced formally what everyone had long since guessed. The ordeal of preparation has consumed them since then, but it has also